that we in the Senate Republican Caucus are submitting a letter, request by letter to the Senate Subcommittee on Ethical Conduct. We're requesting an advisory recommendation on whether or not a conflict of interest exists when legislation is passed that may be a benefit to a member's personal real estate holdings. And if so, whether or not that conflict is satisfied by an oral disclosure in the committee, such as what was done in the case that happened with the recent legislation that was passed on the game and fish bill. We obviously are responding to the things that were in the paper. I serve on the budget division of that committee and was not aware of this piece of legislation or the story behind it. I did read the story in the paper, had some conversation today with people in the Department of Natural Resources to understand exactly what was going on here. And what we believe is that there is a need for at least some clarification on what is the practice when this kind of situation exists. And we think it's serious enough that we're asking the committee to make a judgment, a ruling on whether or not there is a conflict that needs to be addressed and if this is the right way to do it. So that's what we're here to do. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Let me just make one follow-up. There's the issue of ethics and conflict of interest, and that is what this letter is meant to address. I think another issue that arises with this story over the last 24 hours is more the management of the legislature. When you jam everything into the last week of session, when you jam everything into the last 2 days of conference committees and behind closed doors deal making, this is the kind of thing we are vulnerable to. This is an example of why we need better management of the legislature. This is why we need to do things out in the open in committee hearings rather than last-minute amendments on the floor after 2 all-nighters. So I think this really illustrates how poorly the legislature, and in this case I can speak specifically to the Senate, you just can't keep doing everything in the dead of the night at the end of the session.
As to the specifics of what happened here, he said apparently in his statement at the conference committee that he didn't think it would substantially benefit him in any way. Could this have, since he owns a cabin on this lake, could this give him a financial benefit in terms of property values and that kind of thing?
Well, that's, I think, part of the question that needs to be looked into. I talked to the DNR about what the legislation requires and what the potential effect of that legislation would be. What the legislation says is that it requests or requires the department to implement special regulations for fishing on Fish Lake. And what that means is that calling for it to occur at a certain date is that they would put a limit on the size of the fish that could be taken from the lake. The effect of that would be over time that there would be larger fish available to be taken. That could potentially have some impact on the value of the property on the lake, the value of the lake as a fishing lake. I don't know. I think that's a question that to me is appropriate for the committee to decide whether or not that constitutes a significant financial or potential financial benefit that should be disclosed in some more formal way than what we think actually occurred. So I think it does have the effect of the special regulations would potentially have the effect of making the fishery in that lake more valuable, or at least more attractive to sport fishermen. But whether or not that's a significant benefit or not, I think the Ethics Committee should make a ruling on that.
Well, and Tom, slightly off point, but legislative bodies across the country are at historically low approval ratings. Right? People don't trust what is coming out of legislatures and elected officials. So it is more incumbent upon us than ever to hold ourselves to really high standards. So that doesn't just mean no conflicts of interest. It's of interest. It's no appearance of a conflict. You can't get close to that line. You shouldn't have legislators get close to that line. So I hope we'll be able to do some fact finding to answer that specific question that you asked. But I think in the year 2010, incumbents, elected officials of all type are being held to a very high standard. And again, if you're going to push things into all-night sessions, Apparently, we're going to make it too easy for people to wander over that line. And I think there will be severe election consequences because of that.
What do you think happened? What does it look like to you? What makes you concerned about it?
Well, I don't know exactly what happened. I know that this is an unusual set of circumstances. In talking to the DNR, what they told me, to their knowledge, there has never been a legislative mandate for the department to implement special regulations on a fishery. They are not aware of any mandate to do that. I think typically the department has its own process for doing these things. They make a posting, they have a public hearing, they try to determine what the biological or the conditions are before they implement these kinds of regulations. So it's unusual to have this done, and certainly unusual to have it done in this way. And as Senator Michel pointed out, the fact that it happened at the very close of a session in an unusual manner, I think raises some questions about what exactly is going on and why. It may have been, I think there was some comment in the paper that maybe that there was some misunderstanding. I don't know, but I think that there is some things here that need to be questioned, and there needs to be a judgment made about whether this is the right way to do this.
The Senate does have rules regarding revealing conflicts of interest,
right.
And on its face, it doesn't appear that Senator Chaudhary told the truth. Did he lie about this in the quote you have here, revealing what he said was a possible conflict?
Well, what he's saying, as I read it, is that he says he doesn't think it has a benefit. I think that's a question of judgment. I think that's the question that the Ethics Committee
I'd like to be a little more
answer.
precise. He says that this came from the House,
Yes.
suggesting he had nothing to do about it,
Well,
to do with it. Isn't that a lie?
Well, I think technically what he said is accurate, but it clearly was not forthcoming in telling the members of the conference committee how that provision got in the bill. So I don't know if I would go so far as to say it was a lie, but it was clearly not completely accurate. It was a House provision, but what wasn't revealed is how that provision got in the bill.